2025 might be looked back on as the year that artificial intelligence became mainstream. It has become increasingly common for people to sit at their computer and type in questions and for artificial intelligence to reply. And one of the many things that is alarming people about artificial intelligence, and particularly the chatbots that talk back to you, is the fact that they just make stuff up. If you ask it a question, you cannot assume that what it's saying is true. It might give you a source, a reference, a book that's been published that you can find this information in, and it can be totally made up. A friend recently tried to track down the source of a quote from a theologian. They asked ChatGPT, and straight away it responded with a book, with a page number. The only problem, it was completely made up. The programmers describe these things as hallucinations, and they're deeply frustrating for people who try to use them. We have an expectation of truth. AI comes with the promise of saving time. You don't have to go and look through all these books to find a quote because AI can find it for you. But it doesn't actually save much time when you have to fact check everything it says. We have an expectation of truth in our interactions with one another, and we carry that expectation over into our interactions with machines. But have you ever thought why it is that we have an expectation of truth? Why do many people still have the expectation that when someone phones them and says that they're from the fraud department of their bank, that it actually is someone from their bank and not someone trying to scam them? Why do we expect videos to be real and not AI generated? Well, we have this expectation because we are made in the image of the God of truth. Titus 1 verse 2 tells us that God never lies. Imagine a world where no one lied. The idea is so ludicrous that films are so ludicrous to many that films are made where someone loses their ability to lie and has to tell the truth in every situation, and it's something to be laughed at. But when this world was first created, it was a world in which no one lied. And yet you don't need me to tell you that it's not a world like that anymore. From time to time, an advert is placed in the free press by the Advertising Standards Agency. It begins, we all bend the truth now and then, but advertisers are not allowed to. And I don't think any of us could deny the truth of that statement. I don't think any of us could sue the Advertising Standards Agency for false advertising, because we all do bend the truth now and then. At times we're all economical with the truth. And there in black and white, in local newspapers across the country, is a testimony against us that we have all broken this commandment. We thought about the 8th commandment last week, you shall not steal, and there are many people will say, well, I've never done that, I've never stolen anything, but there are surely few who would ever say that they've never said something that wasn't completely true. But if everybody does it, what's the big deal? Well, we want to begin today by seeing why it is such a serious thing. And so our first point this morning is, why is this commandment so important? Why is this commandment so important? In the Harry Potter books, those who are evil are associated with snakes. The villain, Lord Voldemort, has a snake-like face and can take the form of a snake. He and other evil characters speak Parseltongue, which is the language of snakes. And so when Harry's friends find out that he can speak it as well, they are worried. When others find out, they decide that he can't be trusted. Because to speak the language of snakes is to speak the language of the enemy. And in the same way, for us to lie, twist the truth, tell half-truths, exaggerate, or gossip, or pass things on without really caring whether they're true or not, is to speak the language of the enemy. And that, in a nutshell, is why this command is so serious. Every one of us has an enemy. The Bible calls him the devil or Satan. Who told the first lie? He did. And if you don't believe that he exists, then you've already swallowed one of his greatest lies. It's in his interest either for people to not believe he exists, or else to be obsessed by him. Because either way, he has them where he wants them. That's why many Christians are cautious when it comes to Halloween and some of the aspects of it. For some people, it really is about trying to connect with the demonic, and obviously we want nothing to do with that. For most people, it's just a bit of fun, but the devil and demons, they are real, and so they're not to be laughed at. And characteristic of this enemy is that he is a liar. Jesus said of Satan, when he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. In fact, the reason today why there is suffering and death in the world is because men and women listened to the lies of Satan rather than the truth of God. God has said about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil back in the beginning, "In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." What did Satan say? "You shall not surely die." And Adam and Eve chose to listen to the serpent, and they chose death. But how different God is. He's described in Psalm 31 as the God of truth, whereas Jesus describes himself in Revelation as the true one. So there are two sides, God and the devil, good and evil, truth and lies. And so how we use our tongues or our pens or our keyboards shows which side we're on. Whether we're a child of God or whether we belong to the father of lies. The frightening truth is that by nature we're all on the devil's side. The book of Numbers says God is not a man that he should lie. Since the fall, it has been characteristic of human beings to lie. We have been defined by lies. Now, because we're made in the image of God, we still tell the truth a lot of the time, but we can quickly transition to speak the devil's language, especially when it makes our lives easier. Boys and girls, did anyone ever teach you to lie? Did anyone ever sit down and tell you that you could get out of trouble if you blamed your brother or sister or someone else for what you had done? No. No one had to teach us that. The frightening thing is that it comes naturally to us. The language of the serpent is our mother tongue. And as we saw with our opening psalm this morning, that's a problem because we have a description there of who it is that God will let into heaven, and speech is a big part of that. So we must face up to that fact. But if we're willing to face up to it, there's also good news. And that is that God sent Jesus to free us from the father of lies. Jesus came into a world of lies and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life." He claimed, "I am the way and the truth and the life." There is a way for commandment breakers like us to get to heaven, but there's only one way, and that is through Jesus. The idea that you can get to heaven by by simply coming to church, it's a lie. The idea that you can get to heaven by being a good person, it's a lie. The idea that you'll get to heaven because you're better than a lot of other people around you, that is a lie. The idea that hell is only for really bad people like Hitler, and that most decent people will get to heaven, that too is a lie. How do we know? Because Jesus said that he was the way, the truth, and the life. And he said that no one comes to the Father except through me. To think you'll get to heaven by any other way is not only to delude yourself, but to call the Son of God a liar. So if you haven't yet believed in Jesus, this commandment shows you that your greatest need is to trust in him, because like all of us, you have fallen short of his standards. But what if you are a believer in Jesus? How does this commandment apply to you? Well, for a Christian, any sort of lying is bound up with who we were before, not who we are now. Paul puts it this way in Colossians 3, "Do not lie to one another, saying that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." Maybe you have become a Christian recently, and your life, up to this point, your life for many decades has been to lie without thinking about it, to lie, to try and get things, to lie, to try and hide some of the things that you've been doing. Well, this is telling you that now, as a Christian, you're to be different. To lie, it's bound up with who you were before, not who you are now. And you'll be tempted to go back to that. But that's not who you are anymore. Then finally, on this first point, do you realize that if you're a Christian, you don't need to lie anymore? Why do people lie? It's usually to cover up something they've done wrong or make them look better in some way. But to believe the gospel is to admit to being a sinner. It's to hold up our hands and say we failed, we need Jesus. To try and cover up our sins by lying is to fail to understand the gospel, which says that we're all sinners. And it's a freeing thing to be able to hold up your hands and say, I messed up, I was meant to do that and I forgot, or I sinned, I shouldn't have done it, but I did. And not to have to feel the need to blame other people. And that's the sort of atmosphere we should want to cultivate in the church as well, because we will sin against each other, even in the church. But when we do, we don't need to cover it up. Satan wants us to hide our sin. God wants us to bring it into the light so that we can find forgiveness and healing. So why is this commandment so important? It's because it shows which side we're on, whether we're on the side of the God of truth or the father of lies. For us as Christians, to lie would be to show that we don't understand the gospel. It would be to misrepresent the God of truth to those around us. But then secondly, this morning, what ways can we be guilty of breaking this commandment? What ways can we be guilty of breaking it? Well, the most basic application of this commandment is to a legal setting, to a courtroom, at a time when there was no CCTV, no fingerprinting, no DNA evidence. The testimony of witnesses to a crime was everything. And so for someone to witness falsely was taken particularly seriously. And it's still taken seriously today, but back then even more seriously. But the Bible clearly intends us to apply this command more widely. Through the prophet Hosea, God condemns swearing, lying, murder, stealing, committing adultery. So lying there is mentioned in the midst of a list of sins that come from the 10 Commandments. We have New Testament commands like in Ephesians 4, Each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. Or in the same chapter, extremely vital in every age, but particularly in an online age, when we can't see the people that we're talking with, when we're not in the same room as them, speak the truth in love. And those New Testament commandments, they're based on what God is like, and they're clear applications of the 9th Commandment and that aspect of God's character. And so all lying is wrong. Inflating your CV, for example. Earlier this year, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, was caught out inflating her CV to claim that she had worked at the Bank of England almost twice as long as she had. She also had claimed to be an economist at the Bank of Scotland, whereas in reality she was running a small complaints department. And people were rightly up in arms about it. At least in theory, we expect people to be truthful, though bitter experience has maybe taught us otherwise. But at least in theory, that is an expectation that we have and that we are right to have. But with the other commandments, don't assume that this expectation will continue if our country continues to turn away from God. And don't assume that what we expect is what is expected right around the world. One of the books I read in this commandment said that in the Far East, truth is whatever people like to think might one day be the case. And that fitted actually with a story that someone had told me about their experience in China. They were over there and there were books or Bibles that were to be transported from one part of the country to the other. And they asked the person doing it whether it had been done. And they said yes, but it hadn't been done. But the culture was, you don't disappoint people. The biggest sin is to disappoint people. You tell people what they want to hear. Now, to us, it's obvious what the right thing to do is. It's to tell the truth. But that is only because of the huge Christian heritage that we are standing on. Other countries without the same Christian heritage don't necessarily see things the same way. But is lying ever justified? 10 years ago, Reese Witherspoon starred in a film entitled The Good Lie. What was the good lie? Well, it was told by a young Sudanese boy who sacrificed himself. He told the rebel forces that he was alone, and it allowed his brothers and sisters to escape. But is there such a thing as a good lie? Many would say yes. To lie, to save someone's life would be okay. The old question of what do you do when the Nazis are at the door and ask, are there any Jews inside? But the whole idea of a good lie doesn't hold up if we believe that God is sovereign and if we believe that God himself defines what is good. Some of the boys and girls will know the name of Corrie ten Boom. She was part of a family of Dutch Christians who helped many Jews escape from the Nazis. And one day the Nazis were literally at the door and they asked if they were hiding any Jews. And her sister was there and said that they were. She told the truth. The Jews were taken to a local theatre to await transportation to a concentration camp. But within hours of their capture, the Dutch resistance broke into the theatre and freed the prisoners. To tell a lie in that situation would have been to say, well, God isn't powerful enough to rescue them unless we give him a helping hand by doing something he's told us not to do. And it would also be to assume that God's will for us is always to remain safe. But the Bible tells us that it's God's will for us to be more like Jesus. What about Rahab? Someone will say, well, yes, Rahab in the Bible told a lie. But she had literally been converted from a life of prostitution 5 minutes before that, maybe the night before that. So we should probably be careful about setting her up as a moral example. Jesus is our great example, and he would not and could not lie. Rahab was commended for her faith, not for her lie. But chances are none of us are going to be in a situation where we can save someone's life by telling a lie. The vast majority of the time we'll be tempted to lie for selfish reasons. But whatever the reason, whatever pressure you're under, God's people are to represent him in the world by only speaking the truth. But is a lie only a lie if we know it's a lie? Well, clearly not. If something isn't true and we pass it on as fact, we're breaking this commandment. And so as Christians, we have a responsibility not just to pass on things that we hear just because we'd like them to be true. And Christians can be particularly bad at this. Many Christians pass on stories which have long since been disproved or which are just silly because they think it supports the Bible. There's a story that's been circulating since at least the 1960s that NASA were forecasting the position of the sun, moon and planets before they sent up a satellite, but then suddenly their computer ground to a halt. And the story goes they found that the problem was that there was a day missing in space. They scratched their heads. How could there be a day missing? Until suddenly someone remembered a Bible story he'd heard in Sunday school about the sun standing still. And there you have the missing day. Well, Joshua chapter 10 tells us that the sun stood still for a whole day. And as Bible-believing Christians, we believe that 100%. But there's no way that you can prove or disprove that from looking into space. And yet Christians pass it on because they think it backs up their faith, when it actually makes them look gullible and it dishonours the God of truth. Ministers sometimes unintentionally break this commandment when they preach, even when they preach in the 9th Commandment. In one of the commentaries I read on this commandment, the author quotes George Orwell. The author writes, "It is not easy to stand up for the truth." George Orwell said, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." But actually, George Orwell never said that. And in this day and age, it takes 30 seconds on the internet to verify whether a quote is real or not. And Christian authors and publishers should hold themselves to higher standards than secular publishers, not lower ones. If people in the pew hear a minister use an illustration or a quote or a statistic which they know is false or which they can easily check and find out is false, it's not going to give much confidence in the rest of what he says. One area where whole groups of Christians often break the 9th Commandment is when it comes to Bible versions and what they say about them. And most of the time it's not people deliberately lying, but they're repeating things that they've heard which aren't true. And so be careful about repeating things which people tell you about Bible translations, particularly about reasons why one translation differs from another. It's not a victimless crime. People's confidence in the Bible that they're reading is shaken. Someone tells them something that isn't true, but they have no way of verifying it, and they assume the other person must be right, and sometimes they'll stop reading the Bible altogether. We also need to be careful about how we talk about situations in the church. Imagine you hear someone say, "The elders here, they just don't listen." And you're shocked. How terrible. Here is someone who's had a concern, they've gone to the session about it, and the elders just haven't been interested. And undoubtedly there are places where that happens. But in my experience, what it often means is, well, I spoke to the elders, they prayed about it, they formally discussed it at a session meeting, and then they came to a conclusion which was different from from what I wanted them to come to. They came to a decision I didn't agree with. But in that situation, have the elders listened? Yes, they've listened, they've prayed about it, they've discussed it. Not agreeing with someone isn't the same as not listening to them. But as far as the people who hear that story are concerned, the elders have simply refused to listen, and division and dissension are stirred up. Another area this commandment is frequently broken in churches is the reasons people give for not doing things or stopping doing things. And that is an age-old problem. For 16 years, in his Edwardian Sunday School magazine, J.P. Struthers had a monthly series entitled Reasons for Not Going to Church. It consisted, each month there was a page, and his wife drew the illustration, and he put on the caption. And so it was a record of over 100 reasons that people had given him or other ministers as to why they weren't in church more or why they didn't go at all. And they were often humorous. For example, the person, or unintentionally humorous, the person who had just performed a lead role at the theatre but said that they don't like coming to church because their pew was near the front and they didn't like to be stared at. Better to say nothing than give a reason that isn't really the real reason. We should also be careful about repeating things which we would like to be true but almost certainly aren't. To take a current example, and this isn't one that I've heard anyone in the church discuss, so this isn't trying to get at anyone. 10 men are currently on trial in France for claiming that Brigitte Macron, the French president's wife, is actually a man. The claim has been mainly popularized by an American Catholic YouTuber, Candace Owens. And President Macron is no friend of Christians. Perhaps we might like the idea that he's actually married to a transgender man because it would undermine him. But if Brigitte Macron is actually a woman, then for any Christian to say that she's a man would be to break the 9th Commandment. And interestingly, those who were in court this past week used the defense of satire. They don't seem to have had the courage of their convictions. Now they have their day in court. Now, that doesn't mean, as Christians, we are to unthinkingly accept everything that the news media, the mainstream media tells us. I was at a ministers' conference in September, and one of the ministers there made a point that we have a lot of people in our churches who still believe everything that the BBC says. And particularly when it comes to the mainstream media, we need to be aware of how certain stories are spun. It's harder for them to get away with just making things up altogether, but how a story is spun can really change how people perceive it. To give one real-life example, during COVID, one of the RP ministers in Ireland was in a Zoom meeting with the government minister for faith and communities, so the different church leaders there and so on. And this government minister was a Christian, and he had fought very hard for churches to stay open. And so in that meeting, they were told by the actual government minister that there was going to be a lockdown, another lockdown, but that churches could stay open unless they voluntarily decided to close. But guess how that was reported on the BBC that night? Guess what the headline was? Churches to close. Now, it wasn't a complete lie, because some churches were always going to take the most cautious route and close. But it didn't represent what had been said. It didn't represent the actual position. And it was a complete nightmare for churches where the ministers and elders wanted to stay open because their people were watching the news and said, well, I see we'll not be there on Sunday. I see churches are going to close again. Or just on Friday, there was a Sky News headline entitled, Manufactured Panic, Immigration Not Near Top of Most People's Concerns, polls suggest, and this is not a comment on immigration in any way, in one way or another, it's just on the headline. So the poll had said that only 26% of people thought that immigration was the biggest local issue. But what the headline didn't tell you was that 52% of people, the majority of people, thought it was the biggest problem facing the country as a whole. But one of the good things about social media is Twitter or X allows people to add context. And so Sky News were forced to update the article, which, as far as I can see, the first time round, it didn't even include that 52% figure. And nor did it say that at the local level, immigration was the second biggest concern after cost of living. But it was a poll commissioned by a group with a very particular agenda, and the initial news article reflected that agenda. We need to realize that people have an agenda. It's true for the BBC, it's true for Sky News, it's true for Candace Owens and those like her. I mentioned the positive aspect of social media there in terms of fact-checking big corporations, holding them to some account for what they say. But it also means that anyone can say anything they want. I mentioned when we were talking about the 6th Commandment, it was just after the video had come out of that Ukrainian girl in America being brutally murdered on a train. But after that happened, people are immediately on social media saying, well, look at the video, you'll see that there's not enough blood, it's obviously fake. And they said the same thing about Charlie Kirk. Social media, people can say anything they want to, with anonymous accounts often and very little accountability. As Christians, we should be careful about repeating stories and claims that it is almost impossible to verify. If it's not possible or very difficult to prove a statement to be false, it's usually not reasonable to believe it. To take a slightly silly example, if someone were to say that they used to be able to fly, but they never used their powers and now they can no longer fly, it would be irrational to believe that because it could never be proved false. And you are not obligated to believe something like that. And that includes Christianity. If Christianity weren't true, it would be possible for it to be proved false. It's very different from something like Mormonism, where you have Joseph Smith who allegedly discovers these gold tablets and he's able to read them, but where are the tablets now? It's part of what the Apostle Paul is saying when he says that if Jesus isn't risen, it's all worthless. All that had to be done was to produce the body of Jesus, and the whole thing could have been shown to be fake. All people have to do today is prove that the Bible has a single contradiction. If Christianity was false, it would be easily disprovable. And the Bible does give us a pattern that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proofs. And Jesus did make extraordinary claims. He performed countless, but to back it up, he performed countless miracles. He rose from the dead. He was seen by 500 people. God doesn't ask you to believe in Christianity despite a lack of evidence. He asks you to believe in Christianity because of the evidence. And yet there are always some who would believe myths, such as the fact that the claim that the disciples stole Jesus' body. So even at the start, in the face of the truth of what Jesus did, there are always those making up counter stories. So believing in Christianity isn't irrational. In fact, it's those who don't believe God's account of why the world exists that are irrational. Someone said that one of the big problems with evolution the theory of evolution is that it has the hallmarks of a conspiracy. It looks at the plain meaning of things. It looks at a beautiful, complex world and says, that happened by chance. Christianity has nothing to fear from its claims being examined and scrutinized. And as Christian people, we should say things which would stand up if they too were examined and scrutinized. We read earlier Paul's warning about those who make confident assertions about things they don't understand. And sadly, that is an all too common tendency among Christians. We read earlier, Paul warns Timothy, refuse old wives' tales and train yourself for godliness. An interesting contrast. And that expression, old wives' tales, it refers to things with no basis in fact or history. And Paul says that they hinder the pursuit of godly living. But why did those tales with no basis in fact or history prove attractive back then? Why do they prove attractive now? Have you ever thought about how attractive it is to our pride to claim that we know what's really going on when most people don't? That everyone else has been taken in, but we haven't. The early church had a big problem with something called Gnosticism. It taught that people were saved through secret knowledge that was revealed to them and not to others. And do you see how that appeals to our pride? Here's a secret that most people don't know, but I do. Paul tells Timothy, avoid the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. And so there are a world of applications of this commandment. In short, it calls us to change our speech, to make it more like Jesus. And may this commandment drive us to him. He said that everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. How we react to this commandment will show whether we belong to him or not. And if you do belong to him this morning, remember that he was falsely accused, that lies were told about him, so that on the day of judgment, when the true charges against our sins are read out, he might say, well, yes, they are true, every single one of them, but they belong to me, and I have paid their penalty. And he will say to us on that day, well done, good and faithful servant. And by his grace, those words will be true. Amen. We sing in closing from Psalm 31, Psalm number 31, the first 5 verses on page 55. And the verse 5 there on page 55, God is called the God of truth. And if we take refuge in this God, we have no need to be ashamed. In ourselves, we do have reason to be ashamed for our breaking of all the commandments, including this one. We've reason to be ashamed of things we've said, things unfitting for Christians, things that we would be embarrassed to hear repeated. Jesus says that on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. But on the cross, he took our sin and our shame. And so we can sing with certainty about that day that we will not be put to shame. So Psalm 31, the first 5 verses, if you're able, we'll stand as we sing.